All right, so it's recording now. Awesome. So welcome to the second week of developing a theory of change and the second week to the M in MEL. In today's session, we're going to bring this week's learning content into practice. So Leanne is going to go through the steps of how to build a theory of change, and we'll be using the Castlemaine 500 example. So in this, as we do the demonstration, you will have the opportunity to share your insights and how you may have approached the task differently, or ask any questions on what you're still uncertain about as well. So as I mentioned earlier, just keep yourself on mute except when speaking, and use the chat box or the raised hand function if you would like to communicate something to the broader group or to Leanne or myself. And we are recording the session today for those who can't make it, and it will only be recording the plenary session, so not the breakout groups. So the agenda for today, as I mentioned, Leanne's going to take us through step by step on how to build a theory of change for the Castlemaine 500 example. Some of you may have attempted this already. Some of you may have not got around to it yet, but that's okay. We'll go through this process. And just keeping in mind also, so there are 4 project groups that I think are working on Castlemaine 500 example. So we're going to demonstrate the example today, but we would expect that then perhaps will be different examples included in the actual project work that eventually gets submitted as well. And you will also have the opportunity in this session to use the breakout groups to discuss what you have learnt either in the online session or through the ACIAR learning management system, and if you still have some questions there. So just wanted to get a bit of a sense of how comfortable you are with theories of change, and not necessarily just in this course, but overall, so we can just sort you into groups accordingly. I'm not going to show the results, so but if you're able to, in the chat box, where it says to everyone, if you just go to and then find my name, so Keisha Krupi, Keisha with the K, you'll be able to type in your response there. So on a scale of 1 to 5, whereas 1 is completely inexperienced with developing a theory of change, to 5 being an absolute expert and that you could teach others about it, where would you sit yourself in developing a theory of change? So feel free to message me that at any point from now. That'd be great. Great, thank you very much. All right, so I'm going to hand over to Leanne now to explain the task, and I will share my screen. Over to you, Leanne.
Thanks, Keisha. Hello, everybody. Really great to see your faces again, and I hope you've had a really good week since we last spoke to you. So just to start up, we're going to give you a little bit of context about the Castlemaine example. And just recap on what that context is, so that you have that context in mind when we go through the example today. So the Castlemaine 500 project it's an energy behaviour change program, and it's focused on changes of behaviour in the home. So residential energy behaviour change, not the behaviour change of, say, industry or big government offices or anything like that. Just home behaviour change. The Castlemaine's a small town in the northwest of Victoria. Of Australia, and there's a mixed demographic there. So it's become very popular for people to move out of the city to that area to enjoy the natural environment. We sometimes in Australia call them tree changes. It means they want to change in lifestyle to be around the trees. So that's very much the case, and that's increasingly happening in Castlemaine. But the demographic then, so it's a mix of people who move from the city, a lot of artists live there. There's also factories, so there's a mixed demographic of working class artists and people who are now obviously working from home and living in the country. The Castlemaine 500 program was funded by the Victorian state government for $2.5 million over 2 years, and that funded a small team of people to run activities for that program. And it ran, it's quite some time ago now, it ran from 2009 to 2011. The context, though, in terms of why this program and why in Castlemaine, is that there was concerns about the level of emissions from energy use, and Australia at the time had the highest per capita level of emissions across the world. So not the total amount, but per capita. So we've got a small population, but still we were emitting above that in terms of above the average for the world. And then within Australia, we have states and territories, and Victoria as a state had the highest emissions per capita in Australia. So that was sort of part of the problem. But there's also opportunities in problems. And so there's also a very committed group of local people, local residents, who are keen to contribute to solving this problem. And so we have this opportunity where there's people who are really interested in doing something about it. And the government of Victoria issued a challenge with this funding and said we want to see 500 households in Castlemaine reducing their energy consumption by 20%. They sort of set a challenge around that. But they're also curious to know if this model worked and whether it had potential to be used in other locations across Victoria, possibly across Australia. And so that's the context of the Castlemaine 500 program. So we're going to move now into getting us ready to start this exercise. To do that, we just need to get clear on that context. So I've provided you a bit of the context there. But we're going to sort of jump into thinking about, in order to think about what our big picture goals are for this program, we're going to first talk a little bit about what this current state was, what it was like before the program and what we hoped it would look like after the program. So I think we're ready to move on to the next slide. Thank you, Keisha. So this orange bit at the top, this is about understanding the needs and context. We've talked a little bit about that just now. I've provided you some of that. It's really important when you step out your theory of change that you do have that understanding of the needs and the context before of the program, before you actually start clarifying the outcomes. So we've talked about the orange part there, understanding needs and context. We're about to move into step one, but there's sort of a link in between, and that's what we'll share with you now. So we've got this pre-populated to make it sort of easier for you from a training perspective. The program is the Castlemaine 500. It's in the city of Castlemaine in Victoria. 2 years, $500,000. I thought it was bigger than that. I think I said $2.5 million. I may have been wrong. A small team of 3 people. And the situation at the start was that greenhouse emissions are highest per capita. I shouldn't say per capita in Australia, and highest in Victoria. And we have this group of local residents who are keen and already active in this area, really interested. So the challenge here is to think about what would success look like if this program was successful? What's our desired future state? This is the problem now, and we have a desired future state. This part, Keisha, I don't think we jump into groups. We're just going to do this as a whole group, right?
That's right. So if you wanted to brainstorm, either feel free to use the chat function, but also if you would like to unmute yourself to provide ideas on what you think that desired future state would be.
So we're asking ourselves here, what would success look like if this program was successful? What would people be doing differently? There's no right or wrong answers here. Just have a go at providing some suggestions of what success might look like. A 20% reduction in greenhouse emissions. Excellent. Thank you, Winnie. Thanks for kicking us off. And that would be amongst the people that we're not for Castlemaine as a whole, but amongst the people of who are participating in the program. Neural, I think we need to understand also the source of emission. Yeah, that would be really helpful, wouldn't it? So households emit emissions through energy use, but it depends on how they're using the energy. But for now, we're just saying it's from the use of electricity. So yes, the government set us a target, 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions amongst the 500 participating households. And what would people be doing differently? Thank you, Dante. You're a good listener. Okay, so we're starting to move into how we could solve the problem. And so they're good thoughts. Let's keep those in mind. This is how we might solve the problem, but what we want to describe here is what would it look like if the problem was solved? And I think we're pretty much the 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 500 participating households is definitely a great definition of success. I think what you're saying, what would people be doing differently? They might be using alternative sources of energy, solar, green, initiating green agricultural development. Yeah, I'm not sure if that would reduce household energy use, but possibly. If the household power supplies were connected to maybe small-scale agriculture attached to the houses. Okay, but what I'm picking up here from the chat is that what we would see people doing differently is possibly using alternative energy, clean energy, solar energy, green energy. Great. Okay. So when you start your theory of change model, it's good to think at the beginning about what it looks like now, what we'd like it to look in the future. That gets our heads into the space of thinking about clarifying the outcomes. Great. So let's move to the next slide. What we're going to do now is we're going to start thinking about when we clarify our program logic or our theory of change, we make a distinction between what is bigger than our program and what this program contributes to, and then what our program's unique contribution to solving that problem is. So the way we describe it, we say broader goals and end of program outcomes. Success at the broader level is usually these bigger picture things, social, economic, or environmental change associated with your program. But at the actual program level, this is about what your program can actually achieve in and of itself. Okay, so programs can't solve, problems at a very wide scale necessarily, but they can solve part of the problem at a particular scale. So an example is that, in Castlemaine, we know we're bounded. We're thinking about the program in terms of this area called Castlemaine, the township of Castlemaine. So the broader goals are these bigger picture things that we want to contribute towards. The end of program outcomes is what success looks like for this specific program. I would like you to have a think about and pop into the chat, or even take yourself off mute and speak to the group about what do you think some of the program outcomes are at this higher level, a big picture goal or an end of program outcome. This is moving on from what we talked about, the state, what success would look like for the program. So some of what we talked about in the previous slide is very relevant here. Clean air, yeah, great. Okay, you can see Keisha's put that in the broader goal area. Do you want to make the font just a little bit bigger, Keisha? Thank you. Okay, Keisha's deliberately put clean air in the broader goal. And does anyone want to suggest why this would be a bigger, broader goal rather than end of program or a program outcome? Thanks, Maribel. So the reason why clean air is a really appropriate broader goal rather than an end of program outcome is because we can't expect this small program to make the air of Castlemaine clean, okay? There'd be other factors that contribute to how clean the air in Castlemaine is. The emissions from energy use would be one of those factors, but it wouldn't be all of it, okay? There might be some kind of smoke pollution coming from the factories. That also contributes to poor quality air. So the Castlemaine program will contribute to clean air, but it certainly can't be held responsible or held accountable for clean air in Castlemaine. This is why a great example of why we would include this as a broader goal, but we wouldn't expect it to be an end of program outcome. We wouldn't expect the Castlemaine 500 project over 2 years with $500,000 to create clean air in and of itself. There's always other factors at play. So what else have we got here? We've got a bigger, broader goal is 500 households using clean energy. I think that's a good end of program outcome because it's very much related to what this program can achieve. Talked about reducing climate change. And you're right, energy, the reduction in emissions is useful, a contributing factor to reducing climate change. So it's going to mitigate climate change. And again, it's a broader goal, but it's not an end of program outcome because the Castlemaine program, it can contribute to reduce climate change, mitigating climate change, but it can't solve it in and of itself, of course. So that's a broader goal. Thank you. And Maribel, healthy people. Yeah. Again, I'd say that's a broader goal. It will contribute to healthy people, but it can't make everybody healthy. That's not the goal of the program. It's not an expected outcome of the program. Acceptable emissions levels. Yeah, so basically, reduced emission levels across Australia, or definitely in the town of Castlemaine, and therefore contributing to reduced emission levels for Victoria and by extension, reduced emission levels for Australia. Okay. Find a model that other towns can adopt. Right. Okay. So this is a end of program outcome. And I think what Joy's picked up on is when I provided the context, the state government definitely wanted, through the program, to be able to test this model and see if it works and if they could use that in other towns, other similar towns. So finding a model that other towns can adopt is a great example of an end of program outcome. So the only thing I'd say about that is that the concept is great. How would we write that? When we're thinking about an outcome, we want to write that as so we're not really trying to find a model. We are trying to find a model that other towns can adapt, but an outcome might be, a way of wording it as an outcome might be we've got a tested and proven model for application in other towns. Okay, that's what we'd like. It's an outcome. It's a state that we want to achieve. Tested and proven model for application in other towns. Great. So I think we've got the hang of this here. I can see there's lots of interesting comments coming in. People are engaging with this, which is great. Minimise the disruptions and circumstances of climate change in 500 households, and it brings giving awareness to neighbouring communities. Great. Yeah. So I'm really pleased you're able to join, Tita, and that you've overcome your internet issues for now. It's fantastic. Minimise the disruptions and circumstances of climate change in 500 households. Yeah. So there's a lot of, you're right, there's a lot of disruption from climate change, and minimising emissions is part of softening the effect of climate change. I don't know whether those 500 households would actually, it's a contributor, but we certainly, there's a lot more going on in terms of climate change than just what those 500 households can do. But I really like to pick up on that point about giving awareness to neighbouring communities. So if we can test this model, and we all know that communities are always interested in what other communities are doing, and word of mouth gets around and people are interested, and there's even some, I presume it's the same in your country, some kind of competition to do things good and better than your neighbours. So that's another option, and that awareness raising is probably an important part of getting the model, people being open to testing the model in their own communities. Okay, so now we're starting to go into some of the activities that people might implement. So I think we should now move on to the next section. We're starting to talk about ways in which we could achieve this, and that is definitely part of the next section of the exercise. And I think, Keisha, what you were going to do is to check in with people now about what they've learnt through this process and what they're still unclear about.
That's right. So we're going to break you up into breakout groups now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for the moment, so that way I can see all your lovely faces. So what I'm going to do, similar to last week when we used the car park example, I'm just going to drop into the chat the Google Slides. So these Google Slides, I've broken you up into 6 different breakout groups. So each group will have a number on it. So you'll see breakout group 1, go to the slide that says group 1, breakout group 2, go to the slide that says group 2, and so on and so forth. You're only in groups of 2 or 3, but we're really wanting you to understand, just to go to the first row where it says broader goals and end of program outcomes, and talk about any key insights that you might have found through this activity that Leanne has just run through. Anything that you found that were a bit, that light bulb moments, anything that kind of clicked, is any key foggies, so anything that you're still uncertain about or any questions that you might have. And then the last column is saying, what would you do differently in terms of mapping out the broader goals and the end of program outcomes? So I'm going to open the breakout groups now, but I will just check really quickly. Does anyone have any questions before we jump in? You'll be in the groups for about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and look at some of the responses. Any questions?
Can I have one, please, Kaisha?
Of course, go ahead.
Leanne, how do we differentiate the outcomes from as a result of the outputs? Or if I put my question, how we can differentiate the outcomes as a result of the outputs or as a result of the process of the intermediate outcome? For example, you mentioned here the outcomes is 500 households in Castlemaine use green energy. In Indonesia, for example, the government, when they introduced the green energy, they provided the gas and also the stove for people. But how we can differentiate it if it is the result of raising awareness of people, and then finally people decided to turn or to convert into like the greener energy?
So I think you're asking me, how do we actually know if this change is created by the program or by some other mechanism? Is that right?
Yes, that's right, Leanne.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So when we evaluate a program, we have to pay attention to that. We have to do some what we call contribution analysis. It's not sufficient to just check if 500 households have reduced their energy consumption. We need to understand why. We need to understand if it was as a result of our program or a result of something else. So that's called contribution analysis. It's a very important part of the evaluation work. And so you need to be thinking about that. But when we're doing a model, a theory of change, we're simply just describing how we think change is going to occur. Then we try to measure that. And as part of that, we check the other contributing factors. So it's an important part of evaluation, but for the theory of change or the program logic part, we don't need to think about that too much at that time.
Thanks, Leanne.
No worries.
Thanks both. All right, I'm going to open the breakout groups now. We'll spend about 5 minutes in them. I will give you a 2-minute warning message, and then we'll jump back into the plenary. So see you soon. Right, welcome back, everybody. We're just going to reflect now on the activity, just grabbing some of your key insights and any questions that you may have. So I'm going to start with group 1 first. So the key insights of group 1, I'm going to share my screen for the sake of the recording, so people that weren't able to attend can see at least what we're talking about. Okay. So group 1 said broader goals we can only influence. That's right. Sorry, do you mean the end of program outcomes you can influence? Who wrote this statement here? Who would elaborate further?
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
What we actually mean was that the program or the project cannot achieve the broader goals. It can only influence a bit, something like that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for the clarification. So yes, the broader goals are the ideal state we want to be, but the program outcomes is the achievable goal.
Yeah.
And we want to run straight into the ideal state, but it won't work. Yes, always want to rush to the finish line. That's right. And good to hear that the ideas are still sinking in. People can spend years learning about theories of change and kind of absorbing all the information, not just 3 weeks of learning. So group 2's key insights, something that can be affected out of the outcomes of the program. The greenhouse gas emission model. What do you mean by that there? Or is this just labeling some of the things that we referred to? I think probably the latter. I might just move on just for the sake of time. So group 3, to define the goals, you have to understand the context and identified causes, absolutely, resulting on the problems and something that your program contributes to. Yeah. So any questions measuring the outcomes? I might leave that for a couple of weeks. I know that might be a bit tricky to hold on to that information, but we will come to talking about measurement in 2 weeks' time. And how would you do it differently? So easier to develop a log frame first. Would start at the bottom of the theory of change rather than working from the top down. Leanne, did you want to mention anything or refer to anything in terms of developing a log frame first? And then
no, I think I'll get to the activities. We can talk about that.
Excellent. Okay,
and,
great.
Yeah, and we'll talk about unintended outcomes as well at the end. Great.
Okay, thanks. Group 4, impact is sustainable and long-term. Yes. It should be measurable behaviour change. Yep, and we'll get to how to measure that impact in a couple of weeks. And that short term is what we're going to be discussing now in terms of the factors that, in terms of what the short term impacts could be. But then, yeah, what are other factors contributing to the outcomes? That is something that we'll talk about when we do talk about contribution analysis when we get to the evaluation module of the course. Minimizing risks, yes. So I think this is more just about specifics of the Castlemaine example, so light bulbs of that. Everyone wants to know how to measure, which is great, and good to know that we'll come to it as well. And then the last group is just a key insight in terms of the actual activity itself in terms of the Castlemaine 500 example. All right, with that in mind, thank you everyone for your insights and documenting. I hope you had some good conversations. I'm going to throw it back to Leanne now and we'll go through the next part of the exercise, and we might just stay in the plenary for the rest of the session.
Yeah, thanks, Kaisha. Okay, so Keisha has filled in what we talked about in that first part, the broader goals and the end of program outcomes. Our task now is to think about the intermediate outcomes. Now, I know this is hard, right? We are starting with the problem, starting with where we want to be. At the end of the day, we're thinking about the future and we're working backwards to say what needs to be in place in order to see 500 households using clean energy. What needs to happen or needs to be in place for us to have a tested and proven model for application in other towns, if that's what we're trying to achieve. So, you know, it's easier when we start with our activities and work up the model. But when we do that, and that's fine if you've already got a program that's already designed and you're just using what you already know about the program, using that thinking to clarify the program logic, that's fine. But oftentimes we don't know exactly what activities we should put in place. And this helps us think more strategically about what activities we might need in place in order to achieve what we want to achieve with our program. So we are deliberately working down. It's harder, it's more strategic. So the intermediate outcomes are the things that need to be in place in order to achieve what we want to achieve, i.e. in order to achieve our end of program outcomes. We implement activities on the ground and there's a series of outcomes or stepping stones between those activities and what we achieve in terms of our end of program outcomes. So there's different ways of thinking about this middle bit, the missing middle we call it, because people are very good at describing their end of program outcomes or their bigger picture goals, and they're very good at describing their activities. They're not very good at talking about the bit in the middle. The bit in the middle, the missing middle, intermediate outcomes. How do we think about that? There's a few different ways. If you went through the training content, you would have seen that. We can start at the, we can do brainstorming. We can say, okay, what needs to happen in order for 500 households to be using clean energy? We can brainstorm it and sort of rearrange our thinking in order to create these outcomes pathways. If we know what activities we already have, we can start from the bottom and work our way up. We can say, we know we're going to do this and this and this. So let's think about how we might map those outcomes out. And another way that Jess talked about in the training, if you watch the video, is using people-centered thinking, which is who would be doing what differently? Who would be doing what differently in order to see 500 households using clean energy or reducing their emissions? And I think what I would like to see that change that, Keisha, is 500 households with reduced emissions. And there's ways of doing that, okay? So using clean energy might be a way. There's many other ways we could get households with reduced emissions. Okay, so our job here, I don't want us to think about the activities. I want us to think about what needs to be in place for 500 households to have reduced emissions. And obviously, using clean energy is an example. I'm going to open it to the floor now for people to have a discussion. Just pop it into the chat like you did before. If you were thinking about these intermediate outcomes, how do we get to the 500 households with reduced emissions? How do we get to a tested and proven model for application in other towns? What might those outcomes look like? And you mentioned some of those before when we were talking about earlier about the broader goals and end of program outcomes. I'm going back through some of the comments that people made before and picking out some of the suggestions that I think are really appropriate to see households with reduced emissions. One was more hybrid vehicles, people using more hybrid vehicles. Another one was that there were more trees. Another one that someone mentioned, using solar energy. Introducing incentives and awards program for households using clean energy. People know about the program, right? Great. So let's have a look at this. Introducing incentives or award programs. So yeah, incentives being made available so that would be, it's a kind of, it's very hard to think about this without thinking about the activities, right? But you know, we're starting to talk now about some of the activities that might be in place, like providing incentives, provision of incentives, or establishing an awards program would be a kind of activity that we would put in place that we would hope would lead to uptake of those incentives, for example, to use clean energy. So that's one part of it, the uptake of incentives for clean energy. So perhaps there might be some kind of solar rebate program that people take that up. It sees participants using more solar energy. We have to remember that this program was $500,000, $500,000, and a small team of 3 people. So we do have to remember to that context. Okay, so if we wanted to put an awards program in place, we would need to make sure that it was something that we could manage with $500,000. And it might be that once the program's finished and the incentives are no longer there, that people stop the uptake of that. So these are just some of the considerations that we need to have. Joy said that people need to know about the program. Absolutely. So there needs to be some awareness raising. Again, we need some activities in place to allow people, but the awareness part, not just of the program, but of the benefits of reduced emissions is part of how you might create some change. Advocate for training and awareness by government agencies. Yeah, so the state government provided, in Castlemaine, they provided the money for 3 people, a small team of 3, to work with the community to create the change of 500 households with reduced emissions. And absolutely, in this context, there was absolutely a training and awareness aspect where people were engaged in that and understanding how they could reduce their emissions. Yeah, so households learn the pros and cons. That's right, they learn about it, they have awareness about it. Sensitizing the households, that's another example of that broader awareness raising app. Providing reward systems or incentives to use energy saving appliances. Great. Advice on wise use of energy. Yeah, pros and cons, incentives. Okay, new innovations that use less energy. Okay, so these are all different ways in which we might raise awareness, get people to engage with the fact that it's important and that they want to do it, are motivated to do it, get people to opt to walk. So there's all these different ways in which we could engage people in reducing their emissions, subsidising the cost. Okay, so we need to think about what's possible through this program, and what some of the intermediate outcomes that were really important in this actual example was that you had this awareness and confidence in knowledge and skills in understanding how to go about it and wanting to do it. And there was a sort of leadership element to this program. So there was a leadership element, champions for change inside the community, and then there was also the households themselves understanding. You've covered very well the household understanding, or the individual understanding of needing to change their behaviour and being confident and understanding how to do it. There's all these ways we reduce our energy. How do we actually do it? Did one mention, apply, reuse, recycle, reduce approach? Tree seedlings, policy, knowledge. Okay, lots of, so as you can see, as we've gone through this, there's lots of different levers we could pull, right, in terms of being able to reduce emissions across 500 households. And of course, as part of the context of the program, we need to know what we could afford, and also what's likely to endure, what's likely to be sustainable. So what we want to see is this change happening long term, not just while the program is in place, but when the program ends in 2 years, for that change to keep to endure, for people to have to keep behaving in the way they need to behave, for the emissions to remain reduced. Keisha, I think it's probably, given the time, a good time to jump in again and just check in with people what their insights are.
Sure, I'm happy to do this one just for the sake of time. We are running out of time. So we will just do this in the plenary session. There's not much of us in here today anyway. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So once again, I can see everybody. But feel free to either unmute yourself or type in the chat box any key insights or any questions that you might have in terms of establishing the activities or the influence intermediate outcomes that Leanne has just run through. Anything that you're still puzzled about? Yep, Joy, either start with the ideal or perfect broader goal or the activity. So either starting at the top or at the bottom, yeah. Are intermediate outcomes similar to short-term goals?
Yes, things that we expect to see on the way that let us know. So for example, if we ran a program that provided a bunch of incentives, then obviously the uptake of those incentives would be a short-term outcome that is an indication of future reduced emissions. People turning up to the awareness raising sessions, listening and taking away that new knowledge about how to reduce their emissions does not mean that people will actually change their behaviours to reduce emissions, but their participation in those awareness raising activities is definitely a short-term outcome and an indication that we might get future change. Thank you, Winnie.
Hi, Philip. You're unmuted. Is that intentional?
Sorry, it's not intentional.
You don't have a comment to make?
Following, I mean, this is the first time I'm getting the network well, so I'm catching up.
You're enjoying it, yeah, good.
I am.
That's great. So Tita asked a question, confusion, the activities and the intermediate outcomes, you're right. So the activities are run an awareness raising campaign, provide incentives, the actual things that you do to influence change. The intermediate outcomes would be that new awareness, that new knowledge, that intention to act on that new knowledge, the uptake of those incentives. So the provision of the incentives is an activity. The uptake of those incentives is one of the intermediate outcomes or one of the outcomes of that activity. Does that make sense, Tita?
Any? Can Can you do a little bit more, please?
Yeah.
Because it sounds a little bit confused still.
Yeah. So a good analogy that we use is when you throw a rock in a lake and you get this splash, right? So let's say the rock is the incentive program. We've got the incentive program. We're going to throw this rock in the water, and the splash is the uptake of incentives. People actually understand that they're available, and they want to take those incentives up, and they take those incentives up. So that might be a special price on the more energy efficient light bulb, for example. And then people are installing those, and now they have the habit of always using energy efficient light bulbs. So this is the behavior change or the intermediate outcome from this activity. So the activity, the provision of incentives, leads to uptake of incentives, hopefully, and that leads to behavior change, which is an intermediate outcome. Does that make sense? As a result of that, you are reducing your emissions.
Okay, it's getting better. I will go back and read it again. Hopefully, I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
I might just add in that what I often ask myself is, so if you're doing an activity, so you're running a training program or you're, conducting a piece of research and you produce that research, let's use that example. What happens after that? What happens with that research? People read that research. That is a shorter term outcome. But then from that, they might uptake some of the different elements of the key findings in the research. They might continue to develop, or use some of the findings from your research to develop their own research. This might lead to greater change in terms of, let's say crop yielding or something like that, further down the line. So it's about how your activity, the thing that you do and that you're producing or that you're delivering, what happens as a result of that. I hope that helps too. Ami, you unmuted yourself before. I'm assuming that means you have a question.
Thank you. Could be it's not a question, but I want to contribute to. I think we should instill this thing in young children, those who are in the school. So we need to review or revise these things, or put it in the school curriculum. So the children can be a very good, they can influence the parents that we should go into this, the green energy.
Yeah.
I think this is the way for a change. It's a good way to for children to use children for these changes.
Yeah, that's a very common way of achieving change these days, is using their children to influence the parents. Absolutely. Yeah, very common.
May I have a question, Kaisa and Leanne?
Go ahead.
One thing that
I think it's just frozen there, Nurul, where it's difficult to hear you. And I've just noticed how there's been a number of reflections and questions in the chat.
Yes.
Nurul, if you're able to pop your question into the chat, or alternatively, if you would like to pop it into Yammer, onto the discussion board, we'll be able to respond to that there. And the responses or the questions here, I will pop into a document. Leanne and I will respond to them. And then we will we'll put them up onto the discussion board as well for reflection later. So don't feel that your questions aren't going to be answered. We will answer them at the end of the session. But just acknowledging that there's only 1 minute to go. So apologies, this is a very quick session in terms of how to develop a theory of change. And we will come back to it next week, but we'll be talking more about the principles that underpin your theory of change and any assumptions as well. So with that in mind, we are going to close off the session today. I'm just going to mention as well, Tanya referred to me on Yammer. If you go to the M in MEL page, there's a file there's a, how do I explain? There's a tab that says files. If you click on that, they're the files where you can use this for your project activities. So that's where it's saved there. There's 2 files. One file is a PDF, and that has the explanation in terms of what we're discussing about the desired end state or the current state. And then there's actually a PowerPoint slide that you can use to develop your theory of change. So it's got the boxes there, all the arrows at the ready. All you need to do is just populate the boxes. So if you have any difficulties with that, just pop it on the discussion board in Yammer and we'll direct you to finding those files as well. But with that, so as I mentioned, next week is our last week on building a theory of change. And it would be really great if you got into your project groups this week and had a bit of a go at designing your theory of change for your project. As I mentioned at the start, I think there's about 4 groups that are using Castlemaine as an example. So make sure you don't copy and paste what we wrote today, but have a bit of a think about how you would do this program in terms of developing the theory of change based on the videos that of Jess speaking in the modules as well. Yes, so I might leave it there, but thank you everyone for attending, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Kaisa and Lian. See you next week.
Thanks.